With his infant son growing weaker by the hour and the howling winter storm cutting off all hope of help, Emmett Callahan had begun preparing himself to bury a second body beside his wife's grave. The sound of approaching hoofbeats and the sight of a determined woman with a basket of supplies shattered his resignation and forced him to consider that they might actually survive. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The bitter Montana wind howled through the gaps in the cabin's wooden walls, carrying with it the first flakes of what promised to be a punishing early winter storm. Emmett Callahan sat in the worn rocking chair by the stove, his large, calloused hands awkwardly cradling his 6-week-old son. The baby's face was scrunched tight, his tiny mouth opening and closing in a silent cry that would soon erupt into the wailing that had become the soundtrack to Emmett's sleepless nights. "Shh, little one," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "I know you're hungry. I'm trying my best here." The infant, Jacob, named after Emmett's grandfather, seemed unimpressed by his father's efforts. His face reddened as his silent protest transformed into a desperate howl that echoed through the lonely cabin. Emmett's shoulders slumped under the weight of his failure. It had been 2 weeks since Sarah had passed, taking with her all the warmth and knowledge that had kept their small family functioning. Sarah had been everything: wife, partner, the better half of his soul. Childbirth had weakened her, but it was the fever that came after that stole her away, leaving Emmett with dirt under his fingernails from digging her grave and a newborn he had no idea how to care for. He rose from the chair, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, and walked to the small kitchen area. One-handed, he attempted to prepare the goat's milk mixture the doctor had recommended when he'd ridden into town 4 days ago, desperate for help as Jacob refused to eat. "The baby needs a wet nurse," the doctor had said, his face grave, "or at the very least proper formula. Goat's milk might keep him alive until you find a more permanent solution, but..." The unspoken words hung between them. Without proper care, Jacob wouldn't survive the winter. Emmett had nodded, accepting the instructions with the same stoic expression he'd worn since Sarah's death. He'd buried his grief deep, allowing himself only to focus on the immediate needs of his son. There would be time for mourning later, if there was a later. The mixture prepared, Emmett tested the temperature against his wrist, as he'd seen Sarah do during her brief time as a mother. He settled back into the rocking chair, positioning the bottle against Jacob's mouth. The baby turned away, his cries intensifying. "Please, son," Emmett begged, his voice cracking. "You need to eat." For an hour he tried every position, every soothing technique he could remember Sarah using. Nothing worked. Jacob's cries grew weaker, which frightened Emmett more than the loud wailing had. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, the town doctor twice that distance. The storm that had been threatening all day was now hammering against the roof, making any journey impossible. As darkness fell, Emmett lit the oil lamp and stared down at his son's face. Jacob had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. Emmett hadn't been a praying man since his youth, but that night he found himself whispering desperate pleas to a God he wasn't sure was listening. "I can't lose him too," he murmured, running a finger gently along Jacob's cheek. "Please don't take him from me." Morning brought a temporary break in the storm, and with it, a strange sense of resolve. Emmett knew he couldn't continue this way. Jacob needed more than he could provide alone. The baby had barely consumed enough milk to sustain him, each feeding a battle that Emmett was increasingly losing. He had options, none of them appealing. He could ride to town and see if any of the women there would be willing to help, but that would mean leaving Jacob alone for hours. He could pack up and move them both to town, abandoning the ranch he and Sarah had built together over the past 5 years. Or he could seek help from the neighboring farms, though most were as isolated as his own. As he contemplated his choices, Jacob began to stir in the makeshift crib Emmett had built before his birth. The soft whimpering quickly escalated to full-throated cries that tore at Emmett's heart. He lifted his son, noting with growing alarm how light the baby felt in his arms. "I know, little man," he soothed, though the words felt hollow. "I know you're hungry." It was during another failed feeding attempt that Emmett heard it, the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. He stiffened, immediately alert. Visitors were rare in this remote stretch of Montana territory, especially during the stormy season. He gently placed Jacob back in his crib and reached for the rifle he kept above the door. The hoofbeat stopped, followed by the crunch of boots on snow. A moment later, a knock echoed through the cabin. Emmett hesitated, torn between caution and the desperate hope that whoever was outside might be able to help his son. Jacob's cries made the decision for him. He set the rifle aside, though still within reach, and pulled open the door. A woman stood on his porch, her face partially obscured by a heavy woolen scarf. She was bundled against the cold, a large basket hanging from one arm. Behind her, a sturdy horse was tethered to the porch railing, steam rising from its nostrils in the frigid air. "Mr. Callahan?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "I'm Catherine Winters. I heard about your situation in town." Emmett stared at her, unable to form words. She was a stranger to him, though something in her eyes seemed vaguely familiar. "May I come in?" she asked when he didn't respond. "I brought supplies for the baby." At the mention of supplies, Emmett stepped aside, allowing her entry into the warmth of the cabin. Jacob's cries provided an urgent backdrop to their awkward introduction. Catherine unwound her scarf, revealing a face that struck Emmett as both kind and determined. She was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with auburn hair tucked beneath a practical hat and clear green eyes that assessed the cabin's interior with quick efficiency. "How long has he been crying like that?" she asked, already moving toward the sound. "On and off since yesterday," Emmett admitted, suddenly aware of the cabin's disarray, the unwashed dishes, the scattered baby clothes, the general evidence of a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. Catherine knelt beside Jacob's crib, her expression softening as she gazed at the distressed infant. Without asking permission, she lifted him with practiced ease, cradling him against her shoulder and murmuring gentle reassurances. "He's hungry," she said, though Emmett hardly needed the confirmation. "And from the look of things, you've been struggling to feed him properly." There was no judgment in her tone, just a statement of fact that Emmett couldn't deny. He nodded, exhaustion and relief washing over him in equal measure, as he watched this stranger comfort his son with an expertise he sorely lacked. "I've brought formula," Catherine said, gesturing to her basket, "and some other essentials. If you'll heat some water, I can prepare a bottle for him right away." Emmett moved quickly to comply, stoking the fire and setting a pot of water to heat. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at the woman who had appeared like an answer to his desperate prayers from the night before. "Why are you here?" he finally asked, the question that had been burning in his mind since she arrived. "How did you know?" Catherine looked up from where she was gently rocking Jacob, her expression serious. "Word travels, Mr. Callahan, even in these remote parts. The doctor mentioned your situation to my aunt, who runs the general store. I've had some experience with newborns, so I volunteered to bring supplies." She paused, then added more softly, "No one should have to face what you're facing alone." Emmett watched in quiet amazement as Catherine prepared the formula with practiced efficiency. Her movements were sure and deliberate, so unlike his own fumbling attempts over the past 2 weeks. Jacob, still fussing but seemingly calmer in her presence, was nestled in the crook of her arm as she tested the temperature of the milk against her wrist. "Here," she said, offering the bottle to Emmett. "You should feed him." Emmett hesitated, the memory of countless failed feedings making him reluctant. "He won't take it from me. Maybe you should—" "He needs to bond with you," Catherine interrupted gently. "And you need to learn. I can't stay forever, Mr. Callahan." The statement, though logical, sent an unexpected pang through Emmett's chest. Of course she wouldn't stay. She was a stranger who had shown him an extraordinary kindness, nothing more. He accepted the bottle and Jacob, settling back into the rocking chair. To his astonishment, Jacob latched onto the bottle immediately, sucking with a desperate hunger that made Emmett's throat tighten with emotion. He looked up at Catherine, who was watching them with a small smile. "What did you do differently?" he asked. "The formula is easier for him to digest than plain goat's milk," she explained, unpacking more supplies from her basket. "And babies can sense tension. They know when you're worried, which makes them anxious too." Emmett nodded, watching his son's face relax as he fed. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. "I've been plenty worried," he admitted. "Any parent would be," Catherine replied, her voice softening. "Especially in your circumstances." She moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, tidying as she went. Emmett wanted to tell her to stop, that she'd already done more than enough, but the words stuck in his throat. The truth was he needed the help, needed her, more than he wanted to admit. "You have a fine home here," she said, breaking the silence as she folded a blanket that had been tossed haphazardly over a chair. "How long have you had the ranch?" 5 years, Emmett replied, his eyes still fixed on Jacob's feeding. "Sarah and I came out from Colorado after we married. The land was cheap, though most folks said it was too remote to be worthwhile." "And yet you made it work," Catherine observed, glancing around the cabin that, despite its current disarray, showed signs of care and craftsmanship. The furniture was handmade but sturdy, the windows larger than most frontier cabins boasted, allowing for ample light. "Sarah made it work," Emmett corrected, a shadow crossing his face. "She was the one with the vision. I just provided the labor." Catherine paused in her tidying, studying him. "You're selling yourself short, Mr. Callahan. A woman with vision needs a man with the strength and skill to help realize it. You built this place together." Her words struck a chord, piercing the fog of grief that had enveloped him since Sarah's passing. He looked up, really seeing Catherine for the first time since she'd arrived. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but there was a quiet strength in her features, a kindness in her eyes that reminded him of the better parts of himself, the parts Sarah had always believed in, even when he doubted. "Please," he said finally, "call me Emmett." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Emmett, then." Jacob had finished his bottle, his eyes drooping with the contentment of a full stomach. Emmett shifted him to his shoulder as he'd seen Sarah do, patting his back gently until a small burp escaped, followed by a contented sigh as the baby drifted into sleep. "You're a natural," Catherine said, and though Emmett knew it wasn't true, the simple encouragement bolstered him. "The storm's picking up again," he noted, glancing toward the window where snow was now falling in earnest. "You shouldn't try to ride back in this weather." It was a practical observation, though as soon as he'd said it, Emmett realized it might sound like something else entirely, an invitation laden with impropriety. He felt heat rise to his face, grateful for the cabin's dim lighting. "I hadn't planned to," Catherine replied matter-of-factly. "I brought supplies to last a few days, assuming the weather would turn. If you don't mind, I can make up a bed by the fire." Emmett shook his head. "You'll take the bedroom. I've been sleeping out here anyway to be near Jacob." For a moment she looked like she might argue, but then nodded her acceptance. "Thank you." As evening deepened, Catherine prepared a simple meal from the provisions she'd brought, the first proper food Emmett had eaten in days. They sat at the small table, Jacob sleeping peacefully in his crib for the first time since Sarah had passed. The howling wind outside made the cabin seem smaller, more intimate, wrapping them in a cocoon of forced companionship. "How did you learn so much about babies?" Emmett asked, breaking a silence that had stretched comfortably between them. Catherine set down her fork, her expression becoming guarded. "I was married once. We had a daughter." Her voice was even, but Emmett caught the past tense, the slight tightening around her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, understanding there was loss there, though different from his own. "It was 5 years ago," she continued after a moment. "Typhoid took them both within a week of each other. I was the only one in our household who survived." Emmett nodded, not offering empty platitudes. What could he say that wouldn't sound hollow to someone who had walked the same dark path he now found himself on? "After that, I came to live with my aunt," Catherine added. "I help at the general store, and sometimes assist Dr. Bennett when there's a birth or illness. It gives purpose to the days." The simple explanation revealed much. Her competence with Jacob, her willingness to ride miles through threatening weather to help a stranger, the absence of a husband or children of her own. It also created an unexpected bond between them, a shared understanding that few others could claim. "Well," Emmett said finally, "I'm grateful you came." The wind rattled the windows as if in agreement, and Catherine smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and momentarily transformed her practical features into something Emmett found himself wanting to see again. "We should get some rest," she suggested, rising to clear their plates. "Jacob will be hungry again before long." Emmett nodded, though rest had been elusive since Sarah's death. Tonight, however, with Catherine's steady presence filling the lonely corners of the cabin and Jacob finally sleeping peacefully, he thought he might actually find some measure of peace. As he settled onto the makeshift bed near the fireplace, listening to Catherine's quiet movements as she prepared for sleep in the bedroom that had once been his and Sarah's, Emmett felt something shift inside him. Not an ending to his grief, but perhaps the first tentative beginning of learning to live with it. Morning arrived with blinding whiteness as sunlight reflected off the fresh snowfall. Emmett woke to the unfamiliar sound of humming coming from the kitchen area. For a disorienting moment, his heart leapt. Sarah? Before reality crashed back. He sat up on his makeshift bed by the now cold fireplace, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Catherine stood at the stove, Jacob cradled in one arm while she stirred something in a pot with her free hand. The domestic scene struck Emmett with unexpected force. It had been so long since the cabin had felt like a home, rather than just a shelter against grief and the elements. "You're awake," Catherine said, glancing over her shoulder. "I was beginning to wonder if you might sleep through Jacob's next feeding." "What time is it?" Emmett asked, embarrassed to have slept so deeply while she tended to his son. "Nearly 9, she replied. "You needed the rest." Emmett couldn't argue with that. He'd been running on fumes since Sarah's passing, catching sleep in fragments between Jacob's cries and his own dark thoughts. He stood stretching muscles that had grown tense from nights spent on the floor and moved to build up the fire. "I've made oatmeal," Catherine said, "and there's coffee. The storm's still raging, so we won't be going anywhere today." The casual "we" wasn't lost on Emmett. Already, in less than a day, they'd formed a unit of necessity, 2 adults caring for an infant in the midst of a Montana blizzard. He found himself grateful for the storm that had given him this reprieve, this chance to learn from someone who knew what Jacob needed. After breakfast, Catherine laid out her plan for the day. "You need to learn everything I know about caring for Jacob," she said matter-of-factly, starting with proper bathing. When was the last time he had a proper bath? Emmett's silence was answer enough. He'd managed rudimentary cleanings with a damp cloth, but the prospect of bathing a squirming infant had seemed overwhelming without Sarah's guidance. Catherine didn't chastise him. Instead, she set about heating water and gathering supplies from around the cabin: a wash basin, clean cloths, a small amount of the lavender soap Sarah had made last summer. The sight of the soap with Sarah's careful handwriting on the paper wrapping sent a pang through Emmett's chest. "Your wife was skilled," Catherine noted, seeing his expression. "Making soap is no small accomplishment." "She could do just about anything she set her mind to," Emmett replied, his voice rough with emotion. "This place, everything in it bears her touch." Catherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That's a gift, Emmett. Jacob will grow up surrounded by his mother's handiwork, even if he won't have her presence." The simple observation, free from pity or platitude, eased something in Emmett's chest. Catherine had a way of acknowledging his grief without allowing it to overwhelm the practical matters at hand, much like Sarah herself had done whenever life on the frontier presented challenges. Jacob's bath became the first of many lessons that day. Catherine demonstrated how to test the water temperature with her elbow, how to support the baby's head while washing him, how to clean his eyes and the folds of his skin where rash could develop. Emmett watched, then tried himself, his large hands awkward but increasingly confident under her guidance. "You're a quick study," she said, as he successfully wrapped Jacob in a clean blanket after the bath, the baby blinking up at him with curious eyes. "I have a good teacher," Emmett replied, surprising himself with the ease of the compliment. As the day progressed, they fell into a natural rhythm. Catherine showed Emmett how to properly prepare formula, how to burp Jacob after feedings, how to swaddle him for sleep. Between lessons, they worked side by side, Emmett tending to indoor chores he'd neglected since Sarah's death, Catherine cooking and organizing the supplies she'd brought. The storm continued unabated, wind howling around the cabin's corners, snow piling against the windows until the light filtering through took on a bluish quality. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped further, and Emmett found himself chopping extra firewood in the small lean-to attached to the cabin. "Your ranch," Catherine said as he carried an armload inside. "Is it managing with you focused on Jacob?" The question hit a nerve. The truth was, Emmett had been doing the bare minimum, feeding the horses and the milk cow kept in the barn, ensuring the chickens were protected from predators. The rest of the operation, the small herd of cattle, the vegetable garden now buried under snow, the endless repairs that frontier life demanded, had fallen by the wayside. "It's surviving," he said finally. "That's about all I can say." Catherine nodded, considering. "Do you have help? Hired hands?" "Just one. Miguel comes by every few days to check on the herd, mend what needs mending. He worked for Sarah's father back in Colorado, followed us here when we married." Emmett stacked the wood neatly by the fireplace. "He's been a godsend these past weeks, but he has his own family, his own responsibilities." "And your family? Sarah's family? Is there no one who could come?" The question wasn't meant to wound, but Emmett felt the sting nonetheless. "My parents passed years ago. Sarah's folks are elderly, still in Colorado. I sent word of her passing, but winter travel." He let the sentence hang, unnecessary to explain the impossibility of crossing the mountains in winter. Catherine's expression softened. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." "No, it's a fair question," Emmett replied, surprising himself with his candor. "The truth is, I've been so focused on keeping Jacob alive that I haven't thought much beyond tomorrow. One day at a time is all anyone can manage in grief," Catherine said quietly. "I remember after losing Daniel and Lily, there were days when getting out of bed seemed an insurmountable task." "How did you do it?" Emmett asked, genuinely wanting to know. "How did you find your way back?" Catherine was silent for a long moment, her hands busy with mending one of Jacob's small garments. "I'm not sure I have entirely," she admitted. "But helping others, working with Dr. Bennett, assisting with births and illnesses, it gives purpose to days that might otherwise feel empty." The honesty of her answer moved Emmett more than any platitude could have. Here was someone who understood, who didn't offer false promises of grief's end, but instead showed how to carry it forward into a life that still held meaning. As evening settled over the cabin, bringing with it another feeding for Jacob and a simple dinner for themselves, Emmett found himself studying Catherine in the lamplight. Her presence had transformed the cabin in just one day, not erasing Sarah's absence, but somehow making it less of an abyss and more of a space that could eventually be filled with new life. 3 days passed in the gentle rhythm they had established. The storm showed no signs of abating, snow continuing to fall in thick, silent blankets that transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful. Emmett found himself increasingly adept at caring for Jacob, his initial fears giving way to a growing confidence under Catherine's patient guidance. On the morning of the 4th day, Emmett woke before Catherine, Jacob stirring beside him in the cradle he'd moved near his makeshift bed. Without waking her, he prepared the formula as she'd taught him and settled into the rocking chair with his son. Jacob's eyes, so like Sarah's in their deep blue intensity, gazed up at him as he fed, a connection forming that Emmett had feared might never develop in those desperate days before Catherine's arrival. "You didn't need to let me sleep," Catherine said softly from the bedroom doorway, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way Emmett had not yet seen. The sight caught him off guard, reminding him that she was not just a caretaker, but a woman, one whose presence had begun to fill the cabin with something beyond mere competence. "You've done enough," he replied, keeping his eyes on Jacob. "Figured it was time I started pulling my weight." Catherine crossed to the stove, stoking the fire he'd already built up. "You're a fast learner," she observed, a note of approval in her voice that warmed him more than it should have. Their day began as the others had, with shared tasks and the care of Jacob interspersed with conversation that grew increasingly comfortable. Catherine shared stories of her life before her losses, her childhood in Ohio, her courtship with Daniel, the joy of Lily's birth. Emmett, in turn, found himself speaking of Sarah more freely than he had since her passing, recounting their dreams for the ranch, the plans they'd made for Jacob's future. She wanted him to have education, Emmett said as they sat at the table for the midday meal, Jacob sleeping peacefully in his cradle. Not just ranch work, though, that too. Books, learning, all the things she valued. Catherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It's a good dream, one you can still give him." "If we survive," Emmett said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "The ranch, I mean, without Sarah," he trailed off, the magnitude of what he faced settling over him like a physical weight. "You'll manage," Catherine said with quiet certainty. "One day at a time." After lunch, Emmett needed to check on the livestock. The barn was only 50 yards from the cabin, but in the blizzard conditions it might as well have been miles. He bundled up in his heaviest coat and scarf, prepared to battle the elements. "Be careful," Catherine cautioned, concern evident in her expression. "Tie a rope from the porch to the barn if you need to. Men have been lost in blizzards just steps from their own doors." Her worry touched him. "I'll be careful," he promised, more affected by her concern than he wanted to admit. The journey to the barn was brutal, wind cutting through his layers as if they were nothing, snow blinding him despite the hat pulled low over his eyes. Inside the barn, the animals were restless from their confinement, but healthy. Emmett worked quickly, ensuring they had food and that the structure remained sound against the storm's assault. As he finished his chores, a sound caught his attention, a low moaning that didn't match the wind's howl. Following it to the back of the barn, he discovered his milk cow in distress, her sides heaving unnaturally. She was close to calving, something he'd anticipated but not expected for at least another week. Cursing under his breath, Emmett realized he faced a dilemma. The cow needed help, but he had limited experience with difficult births. Sarah had always been the one with the gentle touch needed for such things. Miguel would know what to do, but there was no way to reach him in the storm. Making his decision, Emmett secured the other animals and fought his way back to the cabin, the journey taking twice as long against the wind that seemed determined to drive him to his knees. He burst through the door, snow swirling around him, to find Catherine sitting by the fire with Jacob in her arms. Her expression shifted instantly, from welcome to alarm at the sight of him. "The milk cow," he gasped, catching his breath. "She's calving, and something's wrong." Catherine was on her feet immediately, practical as ever. "We'll need to take Jacob with us. He can't stay here alone." Emmett wanted to argue. A newborn in a freezing barn was the last thing he wanted, but there was no alternative. Together, they bundled Jacob securely, wrapped him in extra blankets, and prepared for the trek to the barn. The journey was a nightmare, wind threatening to tear Jacob from their grasp, despite the sling Catherine had fashioned to keep him secure against Emmett's chest. By the time they reached the barn, all three were coated in snow, though Jacob remained relatively warm against his father's body. Inside, the situation had deteriorated. The cow was lying on her side, her breathing labored, eyes rolling in distress. Catherine handed Jacob to Emmett and approached the animal with a confidence that surprised him. "I grew up on a farm," she explained, seeing his expression. "And I've assisted Dr. Bennett with enough births, human and animal, to know what to look for." Over the next hour, Catherine guided Emmett through the process of helping the cow deliver her calf. Her directions were clear and calm, even as the situation grew increasingly dire. The calf was positioned wrong, threatening both mother and offspring. "We need to turn it," Catherine said, rolling up her sleeves. "I'll need you to hold her still." Emmett complied, amazed at Catherine's strength and determination as she worked to reposition the calf within the cow. Jacob, secured in a makeshift nest of hay well away from the birthing area, slept through most of the ordeal, waking only once for a feeding that Emmett managed with one arm while continuing to steady the cow with his other. Finally, with a rush of fluid and a last desperate push from the exhausted cow, the calf emerged, small but alive, its mother immediately beginning to clean it despite her fatigue. Catherine sat back on her heels, her face flushed with exertion, hair damp with sweat despite the cold. "You did it," Emmett said, awe in his voice. "We did it," she corrected, a tired smile spreading across her face. "You're quite the cowboy, Emmett Callahan." The simple praise, coupled with the intimacy of what they had just shared, created a moment of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. In the lantern light of the barn, with new life blinking up at them and their own breath visible in the cold air, Emmett felt something shift between them, something neither had anticipated or sought, but which seemed as inevitable as the changing seasons. As they made their way back to the cabin, Jacob secure between them, the worst of the storm finally showing signs of abating, Emmett found himself wondering what would happen when the snow cleared enough for Catherine to leave. The thought brought an unexpected hollowness to his chest, a sense of impending loss that echoed what he'd felt after Sarah's death, though different in its nature and intensity. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having spent its fury during the night. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden beams. Emmett stood at the window, Jacob in his arms, gazing out at the transformed landscape. The snow lay pristine and deep, smoothing the rough edges of the ranch into gentle curves and drifts that sparkled in the sun. "It's beautiful," Catherine said, coming to stand beside him. She'd been checking on the supplies, taking inventory of what remained. "Though the road to town will be impassable for at least another day or two." Emmett nodded, trying to ignore the relief he felt at her assessment. Each day the snow kept her here was another day he didn't have to face the reality of raising Jacob alone, another day of companionship that had begun to feel dangerously necessary. "I should check on the calf," he said, reluctant to break the peaceful moment, but needing the distraction of work. "Would you mind?" He gestured toward Jacob. "Of course not," Catherine replied, taking the baby with practiced ease. Their hands brushed during the exchange, a brief contact that nevertheless sent warmth through Emmett's chest. He pulled away quickly, disconcerted by his reaction. The walk to the barn was easier without the driving snow, though the drifts reached past his knees in places. Inside, he found the cow and her calf doing well, the little one already standing on wobbly legs, nursing vigorously. The sight brought a smile to Emmett's face, new life continuing despite loss, a reminder that the world moved forward even when grief made it seem impossible. When he returned to the cabin, he found Catherine at the table, a piece of paper before her, pen in hand. Jacob slept peacefully in his cradle nearby. "Writing a letter?" Emmett asked, shrugging out of his coat. "Making a list," she corrected. "Things you'll need for Jacob in the coming months. Formula ingredients, cloths for diapers, remedies for common ailments." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "So you'll be prepared when you're on your own again." The words hung between them, acknowledging what neither had wanted to discuss, her inevitable departure. Emmett felt a heaviness settle in his chest. "That's thoughtful," he managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Though I reckon there's things that can't be written down." Catherine's eyes softened. "You've learned more than you realize, Emmett. You're a good father." Before he could respond, a distant sound caught his attention. The jingle of harness bells and the muffled thud of hooves breaking through snow. He moved to the window, shading his eyes against the glare. "It's Miguel," he said, recognizing the familiar figure bundled against the cold, making his way up the path on horseback. "Must have been worried after the storm." Emmett stepped onto the porch as Miguel approached, raising a hand in greeting. The ranch hand's weathered face broke into a relieved smile at the sight of him. "Gracias a Dios," Miguel called, dismounting with the agility of a much younger man. "When the storm lasted so long, Carmela and I feared the worst." "We managed," Emmett replied, suddenly aware of how that "we" would sound. "Miss Winters has been helping with Jacob. She rode out just before the storm hit." Miguel's dark eyes took in this information with interest, his gaze moving past Emmett to where Catherine now stood in the doorway, Jacob in her arms. "Señorita," Miguel acknowledged with a respectful nod. "You are the angel my wife prayed would come." Catherine flushed slightly at the description. "Hardly an angel, Mr. Miguel. Just a neighbor offering help where needed." "Miguel Vargas," he corrected with a warm smile. "And any help for this man and his son is heaven sent, believe me." They invited Miguel inside to warm up, and Catherine set about preparing coffee while Emmett filled his friend in on the events of the past days, including the successful calving. "You assisted with the birth?" Miguel asked Catherine, clearly impressed. "Most city women would faint at the sight." "Miss Winters grew up on a farm," Emmett explained, a note of pride in his voice that surprised even him. "She knew exactly what to do." "My father raised dairy cattle in Ohio," Catherine added modestly. Helping with calving was just part of life. Miguel studied them both over the rim of his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. Though he said nothing, Emmett could read the question in his old friend's eyes, could sense the conclusions being drawn about the domestic scene he'd walked into. After finishing his coffee, Miguel insisted on checking the rest of the livestock and assessing any damage the storm might have caused to the outbuildings. Emmett accompanied him, leaving Catherine with Jacob. Outside, as they trudged through the snow toward the far pasture, Miguel finally spoke what was on his mind. "She seems a good woman," he said carefully. "Capable." "She is," Emmett agreed, keeping his tone neutral. "And the baby? He is well with her?" Better than he was with just me fumbling through, Emmett admitted. She knows what she's doing. Miguel nodded, silent for a few more steps before asking, "Will she stay?" The question, so direct and yet so complicated, hit Emmett like a physical blow. "It's not like that, Miguel. She came to help because the doctor in town mentioned our situation. She has her own life to return to." "Ah," Miguel said, unconvinced. "And this life of hers, it is full. She has family waiting?" "She lives with her aunt, helps at the general store." Emmett frowned, realizing how little he actually knew about Catherine's day-to-day existence in town. "I haven't asked for details." "Perhaps you should," Miguel suggested quietly. "Before the snow melts and the decision is made by circumstance rather than choice." Emmett stopped walking, turning to face his friend. "It's been barely 3 weeks since Sarah died. What kind of man would I be if I—" He couldn't finish the thought, the very idea seeming a betrayal of his grief. Miguel's expression softened with understanding. "A human one, amigo. Sarah was my friend too, you know this. She would not want you and Jacob to suffer alone out of some misplaced loyalty to her memory." The words struck deeper than Miguel could have known, touching on the guilt that had been growing alongside Emmett's appreciation for Catherine's presence. "It's too soon," Emmett insisted, "and presumptuous besides. Miss Winters came to help out of kindness, not to replace what I've lost." "No one suggests replacement," Miguel said gently, "but perhaps an addition, a new chapter." He shrugged, turning to continue their inspection of the property. Just an old man's thoughts. When they returned to the cabin, they found Catherine singing softly to Jacob, a lullaby in a sweet, clear voice that carried across the room. She stopped when they entered, a flush spreading across her cheeks at being overheard. "My apologies," she said. "It's just something my mother used to sing." "Don't apologize," Emmett said quickly. "It's nice to hear singing in the house again." The words slipped out before he could consider their implication, and a moment of awkward silence followed, broken only when Miguel announced it was time for him to head back to his own home before the short winter day ended. "Carmela will be wanting to know all is well here," he explained, though his knowing glance at Emmett suggested other motives for his departure. "Perhaps Miss Winters would consider coming to dinner when the road's clear. My wife makes the best tamales north of the border." After Miguel's departure, a curious tension filled the cabin. Catherine busied herself with dinner preparations, aware of Emmett's gaze following her movements as he sat with Jacob by the fire. The conversation with Miguel seemed to have shifted something between them, bringing to the surface questions neither was ready to voice. That night, after Jacob had been fed and settled into his cradle, Catherine sat at the table, continuing her list of supplies and instructions by lamplight. Though her pen moved steadily across the paper, her mind was elsewhere, contemplating the life awaiting her back in town. The quiet room above her aunt's store, the routine of inventory and customers, the polite distance maintained by neighbors who didn't know how to speak to a woman who had lost everything. "You don't have to do that tonight," Emmett said, breaking the silence as he added wood to the fire. "The roads won't be clear for at least another day." Catherine looked up, meeting his eyes across the room. "I like to be prepared." "Is that what you are? Prepared to leave?" The question came out more directly than he'd intended, a hint of something like hurt coloring his tone. Catherine set down her pen, considering her response. The truth was more complicated than she wanted to admit, even to herself. The past days in this cabin had awakened something she'd thought long buried, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of being needed in ways that went beyond the polite gratitude of customers or patients. "I should be," she said finally. "I have responsibilities in town. My aunt relies on me, and Dr. Bennett." She trailed off, the excuses sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Of course," Emmett nodded, his expression carefully neutral. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. Catherine stood, moving to the window where moonlight reflected off the snow in a silvery glow. When Daniel and Lily died, she said quietly, I thought that part of my life was over forever. Being a wife, a mother. I packed those dreams away with their clothes. Emmett remained silent, allowing her the space to continue. These past days with you and Jacob, they've been... She struggled to find the right words, ones that wouldn't reveal too much of the confusion in her heart. It's been good to feel useful again in that particular way. You've been more than useful, Emmett said, his voice low and earnest. You saved my son's life, probably mine too in a different way. Catherine turned to face him, struck by the raw honesty in his statement. Jacob would have survived. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Maybe, he conceded. But it would have been a grim existence for us both. He hesitated, then added, still might be. The implication hung in the air between them, the future stretching out after her departure. Emmett and Jacob alone in this remote cabin, facing the challenges of frontier life without the skills and knowledge she'd brought. You'll manage, Catherine said, echoing her earlier assurances, though with less conviction than before. You've learned quickly. There's book learning and there's experience, Emmett replied. I've got precious little of the latter when it comes to raising a child. Catherine moved back to the table, her eyes falling on the list she'd been compiling. It suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. How could she distill everything Jacob might need into a few written instructions? How could she explain the intuition that told her when his cry meant hunger versus discomfort, or the particular way he liked to be held when overtired? I could, she began, then stopped herself. That is, if you think it would help, I could stay a bit longer, just until you're more confident. The offer hung between them, fraught with implications neither was prepared to acknowledge fully. I couldn't ask that of you, Emmett said, though his eyes betrayed his hope. You've already done more than enough. You're not asking, I'm offering. Catherine straightened her shoulders, finding resolve in the practical nature of the proposal. It would be irresponsible of me to leave before I'm certain you and Jacob will thrive. Emmett studied her face in the lamplight, searching for the true motivation behind her words. And your aunt? Your work in town? Aunt Judith manages the store perfectly well with her assistant most days. As for Dr. Bennett, there are other women in town who can assist with births. Catherine was surprised by how easily the justifications came, how readily she could envision an extended absence from the life she'd built after her losses. How long? Emmett asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple words. Catherine hesitated. A month, perhaps, through the worst of winter at least. It was a commitment that far exceeded what propriety might dictate, yet somehow felt insufficient for what was truly needed. Emmett was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine feared she had overstepped, assumed too much about his wishes. Then he nodded, relief evident in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. Jacob and I would be grateful, he said simply, and I can pay you properly for your time. I don't want your money, Catherine replied quickly, but I would need to return to town briefly to explain to my aunt and gather more of my things. Of course, Miguel could escort you when the road's clear enough. Emmett stood, moving to the cradle where Jacob slept peacefully. He needs you. We both do. The admission, so plainly stated, touched Catherine deeply. It had been 5 years since anyone had truly needed her, not simply appreciated her help or valued her skills, but genuinely required her presence for their well-being. Then it settled, she said, a strange mixture of relief and anxiety settling in her chest. I'll stay through winter. The decision made, Catherine felt something shift within her, a door opening to possibilities she had forced herself not to consider since the day she had buried her husband and daughter. It wasn't love, not yet, but perhaps the fertile ground in which it might eventually grow. The next morning dawned clear again, the temperature rising enough to begin the slow process of melting. By midday, water dripped from the eaves, creating icicles that caught the sunlight like prisms. Jacob was fussy, refusing his morning bottle until Catherine discovered he had developed a mild rash that was causing him discomfort. "It's nothing serious," she assured Emmett as she applied a salve made from dried herbs she'd found among Sarah's provisions. "Babies get these all the time. We'll need to change his cloths more frequently and let his skin breathe." Emmett watched her work, his expression a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, less definable. "I wouldn't have known what to do," he admitted. "Wouldn't have even noticed until he was truly miserable." "You would have figured it out," Catherine said, though she understood his fear. The 1,000 small ailments and discomforts that could afflict an infant were daunting to any parent, let alone one learning without a partner's support. "Maybe," Emmett conceded, "but not without a lot of suffering for Jacob in the meantime." He hesitated, then added, "Thank you for staying. I know it's not a small thing you're offering." Catherine looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "It's not entirely selfless," she admitted quietly. "Being here, with Jacob, with you, it's given me something I thought I'd lost for good." The honesty of her statement surprised them both. Emmett's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment Catherine feared she had said too much, revealed feelings that were still too new and fragile to bear scrutiny. 2 days later, the road to town was finally passable. Miguel arrived with his wagon early in the morning, ready to escort Catherine on her journey to collect her belongings and explain her extended absence to her aunt. Emmett stood on the porch, Jacob bundled against his chest, watching as Catherine packed a small bag with the few items she'd brought originally. "We'll be fine," Emmett assured her, noting the concerned glances she kept casting toward Jacob. "It's just for a day or two." Catherine nodded, though her hands lingered on Jacob's blanket, adjusting it unnecessarily. "The formula is prepared in the cold box. Remember to warm it only until it's room temperature, not hot." "I remember," Emmett said gently. "You've taught me well." Still, she hesitated, and Emmett wondered if her reluctance stemmed from worry for Jacob or uncertainty about her decision to return at all. Once back in town, surrounded by the familiar and the conventional, would she reconsider this unorthodox arrangement? "I've written down where everything is," she continued, handing him a neatly folded paper, "and if his rash worsens, the salve is—" "Catherine," Emmett interrupted softly, "we'll be here when you get back." She met his eyes then, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed, unexpected but undeniable. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing Jacob's cheek, then Emmett's hand where it supported the baby's weight. "I won't be long," she promised. The wagon ride to town was largely silent, Miguel respecting Catherine's preoccupation with her thoughts. The familiar landscape, transformed by snow, seemed both beautiful and alien, like a painting of a place she had once known intimately but now viewed through a stranger's eyes. As they approached the outskirts of town, Catherine felt a curious tightening in her chest. The neat row of buildings along Main Street, the church steeple rising against the winter sky, the smoke curling from chimneys, it was all exactly as she had left it less than 2 weeks ago, yet somehow diminished. "Miss Winters," Miguel said as they neared the general store, breaking his long silence. "May I speak frankly?" Catherine turned, surprised by the formality of his request. "Of course." "I have known Emmett Callahan for many years," he began, his weathered hands steady on the reins. "He is a good man, perhaps the best I know, strong in body, but gentle in spirit." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah's death, it broke something in him that I feared might never mend." Catherine remained silent, understanding that Miguel was working towards something important. But since you came, I have seen a change. The light is returning to his eyes, not just for Jacob's sake, but for his own. Miguel glanced at her, his expression serious. I do not presume to know your heart, señorita, but I ask that you be certain of your intentions. Emmett has suffered one great loss already. The gentle warning touched Catherine deeply. I would never intentionally cause him pain, she said softly. Miguel nodded. Of this, I am certain. But sometimes our hearts make decisions before our minds have caught up. He guided the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. Just be sure that is all I ask. Inside the store, Catherine found her Aunt Judith exactly where she expected, behind the counter, tallying the day's receipts, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose. The older woman looked up as the bell above the door announced Catherine's arrival, her expression shifting from shopkeeper's welcome to personal relief. Catherine! Thank the Lord, Judith exclaimed, setting aside her ledger. When the storm hit right after you left, we feared the worst. I'm fine, Aunt Judith, Catherine assured her, accepting the tight embrace her aunt offered. I reached the Callahan ranch before the worst of it. And the baby, Mr. Callahan? Judith pulled back, studying her niece's face with keen eyes that missed little. They're both well, Catherine replied, aware of the warmth that crept into her voice at the mention of Emmett and Jacob. But that's why I've come. I need to speak with you about an arrangement. Over tea in the living quarters behind the store, Catherine explained her decision to stay at the ranch through winter. She laid out her reasoning in practical terms: the baby's need for experienced care, Emmett's isolation, the difficulty of traveling back and forth in winter conditions. Judith listened without interruption, though her expression grew increasingly troubled. A month, possibly longer, Judith repeated when Catherine had finished. Alone with a widower and his child. It wasn't a question, but the implication was clear. It's not like that, Catherine said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized their partial falsehood. What was developing between her and Emmett defied simple categorization, but it was certainly more than the charitable arrangement she was presenting it as. Isn't it? Judith asked gently. Catherine, I've watched you these past 5 years, moving through life like a ghost, helping others, but never allowing yourself to truly live again. Now I see you with color in your cheeks, speaking of this man and his baby with more animation than I've seen since Daniel and Lily died. Catherine stared into her teacup, unable to deny her aunt's observations but reluctant to confirm them. Jacob needs me, she said finally. And the father? Judith pressed. Does he need you too? Yes, Catherine admitted softly. He does. Judith reached across the table, covering Catherine's hand with her own. Then that's all that matters. Propriety be damned. Catherine's head snapped up in surprise at her proper aunt's language. Oh, don't look so shocked, Judith said with a small smile. I'm old, not dead. I know happiness when I see it, and I know it's rare enough in this life that only a fool would turn away from it because of what the widow Parker might say at Sunday service. Relief flooded through Catherine. She had expected resistance, perhaps even disappointment from her aunt, whose reputation in town depended partly on the respectable conduct of her niece. Instead, she found understanding and encouragement. That evening, as Catherine packed more extensive supplies for her extended stay, word of her arrangement spread through town with the speed only possible in a small community. Dr. Bennett stopped by the store, ostensibly to provide additional medical supplies for the baby, but clearly curious about Catherine's decision. You're certain about this? He asked, handing her a small package of powders for infant colic. The Callahan place is isolated even in good weather. If anything were to happen. I'm certain, Catherine replied with a confidence that surprised even herself. And Miguel checks on them regularly. We won't be completely cut off." Dr. Bennett studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Well, you've always had good judgment, Catherine. I trust you still do." Others in town were less supportive, their reactions ranging from concerned to scandalized. The widow Parker, as Judith had predicted, made a point of crossing the street to share her opinion on the matter. A respectable woman, living unchaperoned with a man not her husband, she said, her thin lips disapproving. "Your poor parents would be turning in their graves." Catherine straightened her spine, meeting the older woman's gaze directly. "My parents taught me that charity and compassion outweigh social convention, Mrs. Parker. I'm doing what's needed for a motherless child and a grieving father. If you find that objectionable, perhaps your concern would be better directed toward finding another wet nurse in town willing to make the journey." Emmett moved through the cabin with Jacob cradled against his shoulder, his large hand patting the baby's back with a gentleness that had become second nature. Night had fallen, the second since Catherine's departure, and a restlessness had settled over both man and child. "She'll be back tomorrow," Emmett murmured, as much to reassure himself as to soothe Jacob, who had been fussier than usual since Catherine left. "Miguel will bring her home safe." Home. The word caught in his mind. When had he begun thinking of this place as Catherine's home, too? The cabin remained filled with Sarah's touches, her hand-woven blankets draped over chairs, her dried herbs hanging from the kitchen rafters, her favorite books stacked beside the bed. Yet somehow, in less than 2 weeks, Catherine had carved out her own space here, not displacing Sarah's memory but existing alongside it. Jacob finally drifted to sleep, his small body growing heavy in Emmett's arms. Carefully, Emmett laid him in the cradle, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest for a moment before moving to the window. The moon cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard, the barn and corrals outlined in silver light. In the distance, the mountains loomed dark against the star-filled sky, beautiful but isolating. Had he been selfish, asking Catherine to stay? The question had haunted him since her departure. She had a life in town, people who depended on her, a purpose beyond caring for a widower and his motherless child. What right did he have to pull her away from that, to expose her to the gossip and judgment that would inevitably follow? Yet when he imagined the coming months without her, the cabin seemed impossibly empty. Not just because of the practical help she provided, though God knew that was valuable beyond measure. It was her presence itself, the quiet hum of her voice as she moved about the kitchen, the gentle assurance in her hands as she tended to Jacob, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Emmett pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, a realization settling over him with the weight of certainty. He was falling in love with Catherine Winters. The knowledge should have brought guilt, shame even, with Sarah barely cold in her grave. Instead, he felt a strange peace, as if some part of him had known this was coming from the moment Catherine appeared on his doorstep with her basket of supplies. "Sarah," he whispered to the empty room, "what would you say if you could see me now?" The answer came not in words, but in a memory. Sarah, heavily pregnant with Jacob, making him promise that if anything happened to her, he wouldn't let grief consume him. "Our child deserves a father who knows how to live," she had insisted, her hands cradling her swollen belly. "Promise me you'll find your way back to joy, whatever that looks like." At the time, he had made the promise easily, certain it would never be needed. Now, standing in the moonlight while their son slept nearby, he wondered if this was what Sarah had meant, finding the courage to open his heart again, to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. Morning brought heavy clouds and the threat of more snow. Emmett went about his chores with one eye on the road, hoping to catch the first glimpse of Miguel's wagon returning with Catherine. By midday, with fat flakes beginning to fall and no sign of their arrival, anxiety gnawed at his gut. They wouldn't travel in another storm, he told Jacob as he prepared the baby's bottle with the careful precision Catherine had taught him. Miguel knows better. They'll wait it out in town. The thought of Catherine delayed, perhaps reconsidering her decision to return at all, twisted something painful in Emmett's chest. Had the time away reminded her of all she would be giving up? Had the townspeople's judgment made her question the wisdom of their arrangement? As afternoon faded toward evening and the snowfall intensified, Emmett forced himself to accept that no one would be traveling the mountain roads tonight. He settled Jacob for the night, trying to ignore the hollow feeling that had taken root in his chest. He was stoking the fire when he heard it, the distant jingle of harness bells barely audible through the falling snow. Emmett was on his feet instantly, pulling on his coat as he moved to the door, hardly daring to hope. Through the swirling white, a shape emerged, Miguel's wagon, moving slowly but steadily up the path to the cabin. Emmett stepped onto the porch, shielding his eyes against the snow, his heart hammering as he searched for a second figure beside Miguel on the seat. And there she was, Catherine, bundled against the cold, her face lighting up as she caught sight of him. The wagon had barely stopped before she was climbing down, her boots crunching in the fresh snow as she hurried toward the porch. "You shouldn't have traveled in this," Emmett said, even as relief flooded through him. "It's not safe." "We left before it started," Catherine replied, stamping snow from her boots as she reached the shelter of the porch. "By the time it picked up, we were closer to here than town." She looked up at him, snowflakes catching in her lashes and hair. "I promised I'd come back." The simple statement, delivered with quiet certainty, dissolved the knot of worry that had been tightening in Emmett's chest all day. Without thinking, he reached for her, pulling her into an embrace that surprised them both with its intensity. "I was afraid you might change your mind," he admitted, his voice rough against her hair. Catherine's arms came around his waist, returning the embrace with equal fervor. "No," she said softly, "no chance of that." They stood like that, connected in the shelter of the porch while snow fell around them, until Miguel's discreet cough reminded them of his presence. The ranch hand was already unloading Catherine's belongings and several crates of supplies. "I should help," Emmett said reluctantly, releasing Catherine, but keeping a hand at the small of her back, as if to reassure himself that she was truly there. Later, after Miguel had departed with promises to return in a few days to check on them, Catherine and Emmett sat before the fire while Jacob slept nearby. The crates she had brought contained far more than Emmett had expected. Clothes for all of them, books, toys for Jacob, medicines, preserved foods, and fabrics to make new curtains and blankets. "You came prepared for more than a month," Emmett observed as Catherine unpacked a set of carved wooden blocks that would be years before Jacob could play with. Catherine hesitated, her hands stilling on the brightly painted toys. "I wasn't sure exactly how long I might stay. It seemed better to bring too much than too little." Emmett watched her face in the firelight, the careful way she avoided his gaze, and felt a surge of hope. "And how long might that be? Your stay?" Catherine looked up then, meeting his eyes directly. "That depends," she said quietly, "on what happens between us. On whether this arrangement grows into something more permanent." The directness of her statement took Emmett's breath away. In his experience, women, especially those as well-bred as Catherine, didn't speak so plainly about such matters. Yet here she was, acknowledging the unspoken possibility that had been growing between them since her arrival. "I don't want to replace Sarah," she continued when he didn't immediately respond. "I would never presume to try. But I've come to care deeply for Jacob, and for you, in ways I didn't expect when I first came here." "Catherine," Emmett began, then stopped, searching for words adequate to the moment. I never thought I'd feel this way again. Never wanted to, after losing Sarah. But these past days without you, I realized something I can't ignore anymore. He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. I don't want you to stay just for Jacob's sake, or because it's practical, or out of some sense of duty. I want you to stay because I'm falling in love with you, and I hope, you might feel something similar. Catherine's heart thundered in her chest at Emmett's words. She had come prepared for many things, for awkwardness, for gratitude, for the practical discussion of their arrangement. But not for this raw honesty, this direct admission of feelings she had scarcely allowed herself to acknowledge in the privacy of her own thoughts. She began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the emotions coursing through her. Her fingers tightened around his, drawing strength from the connection. I thought it was just me, she whispered finally. I thought I was imagining what was growing between us, or worse, that I was betraying Daniel's memory by feeling this way again. Emmett's expression softened, understanding dawning in his eyes. I know, he said quietly. I felt the same about Sarah. Like loving you somehow diminishes what we had. Does it? Catherine asked, voicing the fear that had followed her all the way from town through the falling snow, back to this cabin that had begun to feel more like home than any place since she'd lost her family. No, Emmett said with surprising certainty. Sarah was the love of my youth, the mother of my son, my partner in building this place. He gestured around the cabin, then brought his gaze back to Catherine's face. Nothing can change that. Not even finding love again. Love, Catherine repeated, the word both terrifying and exhilarating. Is that what this is? It's what it's becoming, Emmett amended, his honesty touching her deeply. I won't pretend it's the same as what grows over years together. But it's real, Catherine, at least for me. For me too, she admitted, the confession both a relief and a commitment. These past days in town, all I could think about was coming back here, to Jacob. Yes, but to you most of all. As she looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused from years of ranch work, hers smaller but equally marked by labor. I kept waiting for doubt to set in, for common sense to remind me that what I was feeling was just gratitude or loneliness or the natural result of caring for a child together. And did it? Emmett asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. Catherine shook her head. No, if anything, being away only made it clearer. She met his gaze directly. I'm falling in love with you too, Emmett Callahan. God help me, but I am. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then suddenly radiant. Without words, he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth cascading through her. People will talk, she said, practical even in this moment of revelation. They already are in town. Let them, Emmett replied with a shrug. Out here, we answer to ourselves and to God, not to the widow Parker's notion of propriety. The mention of the judgmental woman brought a smile to Catherine's lips. She cornered me at the store, you know. Told me my parents would be turning in their graves. And what did you say to that? Emmett asked, amusement mingling with admiration in his expression. That my parents taught me charity outweighs convention, Catherine replied, then added with a hint of mischief. Though I may have also suggested she volunteer as wet nurse if she found my presence here so objectionable. Emmett's laugh, rich and genuine, filled the cabin, a sound Catherine realized she had never heard before this moment. It transformed his face, easing the lines of grief and worry that had become so familiar, revealing the man he might have been before loss had carved its mark upon him. I wish I could have seen her face, he said, shaking his head in appreciation, then growing serious again. "Catherine, I don't want to rush this. Whatever's growing between us deserves time and care. Sarah's only been gone a month, and though my heart seems to have its own timetable, I understand if you need time," she finished for him, squeezing his hand. "Yes, not because I doubt what I'm feeling, but because we both deserve to be certain this is right. Jacob deserves that too." At the mention of his son, Emmett's gaze shifted to the cradle where the baby slept peacefully. "He's already attached to you," he said softly. "The way he calms when you hold him, how he watches your face. He knows you're important to him." The observation touched Catherine deeply. "I love him," she said simply. "From the first moment I held him, something in me recognized him as mine, in some way I can't fully explain." "He is yours," Emmett said with quiet intensity, "if you want him to be, if you want us to be a family." The word family hung in the air between them, laden with meaning and possibility. Catherine felt tears gathering, the emotion of the moment catching her off guard. "I thought I'd never have that again," she whispered. "A family." "Neither did I," Emmett admitted. "After Sarah died, I couldn't see past each day's survival. The future was just darkness." "And now?" Catherine asked. "Now I see possibilities," he said, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on the back of her hand. "A future where Jacob grows up healthy and strong, where this ranch thrives again, where you and I build something new together while honoring what came before." The vision he painted was so close to what Catherine had begun to imagine herself that it took her breath away. Still, practical concerns remained. "We should think about how to proceed," she said, "for Jacob's sake, and for the sake of my reputation in town, if that still matters." "It matters to me," Emmett said firmly. "I won't have people thinking less of you because of me." He considered for a moment. "We could make it official once an appropriate time has passed. A proper courtship, leading to marriage if that's what we both want." "And in the meantime?" Catherine asked. "In the meantime, you stay as Jacob's nurse and my friend," Emmett suggested. "Miguel and his wife can serve as chaperones when needed, to quiet the worst of the gossip." It was a sensible plan, respecting both convention and their growing feelings. Catherine nodded her agreement, though the word friend seemed inadequate for what they were becoming to each other. "May I ask you something?" Emmett said after a moment of comfortable silence. "Of course." "When you look at me, do you see a replacement for Daniel?" His voice held no accusation, only genuine curiosity. Catherine considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "Daniel was quiet, scholarly, gentle in all things. She studied his face, searching for the right words. "You're solid, strong, not just physically but in your convictions. You face life's hardships head on. You're different men, and what I feel for you is different too. Not greater or lesser, just its own thing entirely." Relief crossed Emmett's features. "That's how it is for me too." Sarah was fire, passionate, determined, full of dreams and plans. He paused, seeming to search for the right comparison. "You're like the earth itself, steady, nurturing, resilient in ways that humble me." The description moved her. No one had ever seen her quite that way before, as a source of strength rather than an object of pity or a vessel of practical assistance. As if drawn by some invisible force, they leaned toward each other simultaneously. Emmett's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch tentative, questioning. Catherine closed the final distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened with the release of feelings long held in check. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, the look they exchanged contained both wonder and certainty. The recognition that what had begun as necessity had transformed into something precious and unexpected. Spring came to the Montana mountains with a gentle persistence, melting the snowdrifts that had isolated the Callahan Ranch for months. The land awakened slowly. First the south-facing slopes where pale green grass emerged from beneath the receding white blanket, then the creek beds swelling with snowmelt, and finally the explosion of wildflowers that transformed the meadows into tapestries of color. 6 months had passed since Catherine had arrived with her basket of supplies on that desperate winter day. 6 months of growth and healing, of quiet evenings by the fire and busy days tending to the needs of the ranch, of Jacob's first smile, first laugh, first attempts to roll over and sit up. On a warm April afternoon, Catherine stood in the doorway of the cabin watching as Emmett sat on the porch with Jacob cradled in his arms. The baby, now nearly 8 months old, reached up with curious fingers to explore his father's beard, eliciting a deep chuckle that Catherine had come to treasure. The scene before her, this man she had grown to love holding the child who had captured her heart, filled her with a contentment she had thought forever lost after Daniel and Lily's deaths. "He's getting stronger every day," Emmett observed as she joined them on the porch. "Doc Bennett says he's thriving." Their trip to town the previous day had been something of an event. Though Catherine had made several journeys back and forth over the months, often accompanied by Miguel or his wife Carmela, this had been the first time all three of them had gone together, a family, for all to see. The reactions had been mixed, as expected. Some, like Dr. Bennett and Catherine's aunt, had greeted them with genuine warmth. Others had maintained a polite distance, their judgment evident in sidelong glances and hushed conversations that ceased when Emmett approached. The widow Parker had made a point of crossing the street rather than encounter them directly. "People will come around," Catherine said, settling beside Emmett on the porch step. "Or they won't. Either way, we know what matters." Emmett shifted Jacob to his other arm, his free hand finding Catherine's with the easy familiarity that had developed between them. 6 months of proper courtship, he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Even the widow Parker can't claim we've been hasty." Their courtship, conducted under the watchful eyes of Miguel and Carmela whenever possible, had been a curious blend of formality and intimacy. They were, after all, living under the same roof while maintaining separate sleeping quarters, raising a child together while carefully observing the proprieties expected of an unmarried couple. "I spoke with Reverend Thomas while you were getting supplies," Emmett continued, his tone casual, though his grip on her hand tightened slightly. "He's agreed to come out to the ranch next Sunday if that suits you." Catherine's heart quickened. They had discussed marriage, of course, planning for a small ceremony once the appropriate mourning period had passed, and spring made travel easier for the few guests they wished to invite. But hearing that Emmett had taken this concrete step made it suddenly, wonderfully real. "It suits me perfectly," she replied, turning to face him fully. "Are you certain, though?" "It's only been 7 months since Sarah." "I'm certain," Emmett interrupted gently. "Sarah would understand. She'd want Jacob to have a mother and me to have a wife." He looked down at their joined hands. "I've done my grieving, Catherine. I'll always carry Sarah in my heart just as you'll carry Daniel and Lily, but it's time for us to build our future." Catherine nodded, understanding completely. Her grief for her lost family would never fully disappear, but it had transformed over time into something she could carry without being crushed by its weight. Loving Emmett and Jacob hadn't diminished that grief. Rather, it had given her the strength to bear it. "Then yes," she said, squeezing his hand. "Next Sunday it is." Jacob chose that moment to gurgle happily, his chubby hands reaching for Catherine. She took him from Emmett's arms, settling the baby on her lap, where he immediately began playing with the buttons on her dress. "He knows his mama," Emmett said softly, the simple words bringing tears to Catherine's eyes. "Do you think he'll remember her at all?" she asked, voicing a concern that had troubled her over the months. Sarah, I mean. I don't want him to forget her entirely. Emmett was quiet for a moment, considering. Not in the way you and I remember people, he said finally. But we'll make sure he knows her through our stories, through the things she made, through the ranch she helped build. He reached out to stroke Jacob's dark hair so like his own, and he'll know she loved him, even though she couldn't stay. The sensitivity of his response touched Catherine deeply. This was the man she had come to love, thoughtful, honest, capable of both strength and tenderness. The winter of shared challenges had revealed his character in ways that might have taken years under ordinary circumstances. I have something for you, Emmett said, reaching into his pocket. I've been waiting for the right moment. He withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Opening it carefully, he revealed a ring, a simple gold band with a small pearl nestled at its center. It was my grandmother's, he explained. My mother gave it to me before she passed, said I should save it for when I found the right woman. He looked up, meeting her eyes. I'd like you to have it, if you're willing. It's beautiful, Catherine whispered, emotion making it difficult to speak. Of course I'm willing. With Jacob still settled on her lap, Emmett slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. The pearl caught the afternoon sunlight, gleaming with a warm luster that reminded Catherine of the moon on snow the night she had returned to the ranch. I love you, Emmett said simply. You and Jacob are my life now. And you are mine, she replied, the words a vow already, though their official ceremony was still days away. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the yard, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had arrived a stranger, a woman fulfilling what she saw as her duty to a motherless child and a grieving father. She would become a wife and mother, not replacing what was lost, but creating something new and precious from the foundations of shared grief and unexpected joy. Later that evening, after Jacob had been fed and settled in his cradle for the night, Catherine stood by the cabin window, looking out at the star-filled sky. Emmett moved quietly beside her, his arm slipping around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice low so as not to wake Jacob. "About that first day," she replied. "When I rode up to your door with that basket of supplies, not knowing what I would find." "A desperate man and a hungry baby," Emmett said with a soft chuckle. "Not much of a welcome." "The beginning of everything," Catherine corrected, turning in his embrace to face him. "Though I didn't know it then." As Emmett's lips found hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise, Catherine reflected that some journeys began with a single step, others with a desperate ride through falling snow. Hers had started with a basket of supplies and a hungry baby, and would continue along a path she could never have imagined, as wife, mother, partner in this rugged, beautiful life they were building together. Outside, the Montana night wrapped around the small cabin like a blanket, stars keeping their ancient vigil over the land. Inside, a family that had been forged in grief and necessity, tempered by winter storms and frontier challenges, rested in the certainty of belonging to one another, not by blood, but by the deeper bonds of chosen love.